The Democracy Forum is a not-for-profit organisation founded in 2009 under the patronage of Baroness Nicholson of Winterbourne. Its principal goal was to work for the furtherance of democracy, peace and the rule of law in order to counter religious fundamentalism and intolerance in our global communities. In an increasingly fractured world, this goal continues to be the driving force behind all of the Forum's activities. Lord Charles Bruce is the current president of the Forum. Since its inception, the Forum has hosted and co-hosted seminars on a wide variety of topics relating to democracy and human rights across the world. The Democracy Forum encourages academics, students, journalists and other socially and politically conscious people to attend our seminars and to participate in the question and answer session. Details are available on our website, thedemocracyforumlimited.com.
The Democracy Forum brings you another not-to-be-missed webinar. As US-China rivalry continues to intensify amid speculation of a new Cold War, many Asian countries are looking on with concern. Will the United States retain its key strength as a model of democracy, learning lessons from the Cold War era, or will those in the region be forced to choose sides? What will be the impact of trade and security priorities, and how will economic interdependence and environmental concerns play out? To examine these and related questions, the Democracy Forum will host a virtual discussion, at which our expert panelists will bring their unique perspective to this unfolding situation. Please join us, bringing your own views, comments and questions.
Hello, I'm Humphrey Hawksley and welcome wherever you are in the world to our Democracy Forum debate, China and the United States, effects of competing hegemonies in the Indo-Pacific. Timely, relevant and right on the heels of the G7 summit in Hiroshima. Now, from the media coverage, many of us could be forgiven for thinking that this summit was all about Ukraine and Taiwan. Why? Because war talk lifts ratings for the media. But that's not the case. The big beasts of the global south were there too. India's Narendra Modi, Brazil's Lula da Silva, Indonesia's Joko Widodo and others. What do they think of the fractious rivalry encroaching upon their nations? Hegemony is defined as the dominance of one group over another, often supported by legitimating norms and ideas, American values or Chinese values, which will or should prevail, or maybe neither. To unravel what is really going on, we have a superb Democracy Forum panel of experts, Peter Harris, Carisa Nietsche, James Rogers, and Jason Kelly. The Democracy Forum chair, Barry Gardiner, MP, is hearing the argument throughout and will sum up with his thoughts at the end. And as always, to give us the canvas and background and to explain some of the complexities, we go to the president of the Democracy Forum, Lord Charles Bruce. Lord Bruce, the screen is yours.
Welcome to this Democracy Forum webinar, which explores the strategic consequences of global power politics in the Indo-Pacific region, and follows hard on the heels of the G7 Leaders Summit in Hiroshima at the weekend. I'm delighted we've been able to secure such an authoritative group of panelists to discuss the topic today. I'm very grateful that they've all agreed to take part, and I'd like to extend my thanks to Humphrey Hawksley for taking the role of moderator. Interviewed last week on the eve of his 100th birthday, the legendary arbiter of Cold War hegemonies and architect of détente, Henry Kissinger, can barely disguise his concern for global security, where I quote, "The balance of power and the technological basis of warfare are shifting so fast that countries lack any settled principle on which they can establish order. And if they cannot find one, they may resort to force." Kissinger asks pointedly, I quote, "Is it possible for China and the United States to coexist without the threat of all-out war with each other. And writing in the Financial Times on the 19th of May, the Japanese Prime Minister, Fumio Kishida, sought to recast the hegemonic rivalry in the Indo-Pacific instead as, I quote, a challenge to the free and open international order based on the rule of law, and channeling the famous address that his predecessor Shinzo Abe gave to the Indian Parliament in 2007, Kishida presented a new plan for, I quote, a free and open Indo-Pacific to lead the international community away from fragmentation towards cooperation. And certainly President Biden's closing remarks to the summit conceded that dialogue should resume, and he expects to see a thaw in US relations with Beijing. However, the emerging political consensus in Washington for decoupling of trade and economic engagement clearly seeks to unwind globalization and pursue a national industrial policy instead. And this was bolstered by the introduction of comprehensive export controls in October last year, where I quote, in one of the toughest actions President Biden has taken against China, Chinese companies have been prevented from developing cutting-edge technologies with military applications. Some commentators have described this action as a major watershed, where the United States has, I quote, essentially declared war on China's ability to use high-performance computing for economic and security gains. And in addition, China is now threatened with the removal of its most favored nation status following the introduction of a bill by Republican Senator Josh Hawley, named the Ending Normal Trade Relations with China Act. Although the G7 communique stated that its members, I quote, are not decoupling or turning inwards, it also stated that they would meet the challenges posed by China's non-market policies and practices which distort the global economy. And indeed, the cumulative impact of this process of disengagement, superficially at least, is not hard to find. A report published by Asian Affairs, our sister publication, earlier this month indicates that Guangdong province was hit by a 12.4% decline in foreign trade during the first 2 months of 2023 compared to the same period last year. And official figures reveal a 10.4% decline in exports overall, while those to the United States fell by just over 24%. And Chinese electronics companies are finding that multinational brands are increasingly moving their key supplier contracts to other countries in the Indo-Pacific region, such as India, Vietnam, and Malaysia. Foxconn, which produces half of all iPhones from its plants in Changzhou, Chengdu, Foshan, and Shenzhen, providing employment to more than 800,000 Chinese workers, is beginning to shift manufacturing capacity to Vietnam, where it has invested $300 million in a new plant on the outskirts of Saigon. And there is plenty of evidence also to show that Japanese multinational companies with decades worth of investment, supply chains, and joint ventures in China have been dissuaded from seeking deals in the United States. The Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States is tightening its review of all foreign entities with business ties to China. A leading United States commercial lawyer has suggested that the committee's diligence will become even more rigorous. I quote, "Do the Chinese have leverage over you? Can they use that leverage for nefarious purposes?" he asks. And South Korean semiconductor companies such as Samsung and SK Hynix, which produce chips from their operations in China, are already suffering from export controls imposed by Washington last year. Well, the response from China's foreign ministry to the G7 communique, in effect, returned the same accusation of hegemonic behavior, complaining that, I quote, "The G7 talks about pursuing a peaceful, stable, and prosperous world, while actually doing things that are undermining world peace and regional stability." And only 2 days earlier, at a press conference in Canberra, the Chinese ambassador to Australia, denounced the AUKUS pact to arm the Royal Australian Navy with British-designed nuclear-powered submarines. Furthermore, in a direct appeal to the Australian people, he suggested that their government's defence plan amounted to, I quote, an unnecessary consumption of hard-working Australian taxpayers' money. Following remarks he'd made in June last year, warning Australia from furthering a military alliance with Japan, the ambassador reiterated that China is not a threat to Australia, and he announced plans to lift the 3-year moratorium on timber exports, a market worth $400 million. So clearly, we are witnessing the strategic use of trade policy as a first line of defense by both the United States and China to define and delimit their hegemonic interests in the Indo-Pacific region. But it is interesting to speculate that this strategy actually may not achieve the intended results. Research produced by the University of California, San Diego, and published early this month by the World Bank and the IMF, which has closely examined the impact of United States trade policy on supply chains in the Indo-Pacific region over 5 years, from 2017 to 2022, indicates that, I quote, despite significant reshaping, China remains the top trade partner of the US. And other commentators suggest that a paradox is emerging with unintended consequences. I quote, while Western leaders are trying to unpick decades of globalization, Asian nations from Bangladesh and Indonesia to Malaysia and Thailand view China as central to their economic future. Rather than decoupling, they seek more trade with Beijing. Paradoxically, this is an outcome Western policies might actually deliver, writes James Crabtree, director of the International Institute for Strategic Studies in Asia. Well, I leave this paradox for the panel to unwind, and please pass your comments and questions to the panel through the chair.
Thank you, Lord Charles Bruce. Absolutely fascinating, a sort of US political drive to decouple, for want of another phrase, putting pressure on others. But the global south is seeking more trade with Beijing. What is going to come of all of that? Our first speaker, Peter Harris, is Associate Professor of Political Science at Colorado State University. And among his many published and co-authored works is The Japan-US Alliance, Its Future in the Indo-Pacific Era, and the United States and the Quad and the Making of a Mega Region. He is going to help us understand the true extent of US interests in the region and its power projection. Is it stronger or is it weaker than we think? Peter Harris, tell us what you know.
Thank you. I'd just like to begin by saying thank you to the organizers, especially Lord Bruce, for inviting me to participate. It's a privilege to be part of such a distinguished panel, and as a native Brit myself, it's very nice indeed to pretend, at least for a moment, that I'm still back home. So my talk will focus on the domestic foundations of U.S. power projection in the Indo-Pacific and the domestic basis of the competition with China. My argument is that these domestic foundations, kind of the depth of US interests in the Indo-Pacific, may not be quite as strong as they appear right now. That's true of the Western Pacific, kind of the Western Pacific half of the Indo-Pacific region, but it's certainly true of the Indian Ocean, the other half of the Indo-Pacific construct. I'll begin by just pointing out why it really matters, how strong these domestic interests in the Indo-Pacific are. And I think it matters a great deal, and it matters for different audiences. People in the region really need to know and have a firm grasp of how durable and credible America's commitments to the Indo-Pacific are. China doesn't have a choice when it comes to engaging with the Indo-Pacific, at least not the East Asian half of the Indo-Pacific. China's what we call a resident power. It's in the region. It can't help but engage with its own region. Bob Gates, the former defense secretary, he called the United States a resident power, but it's a resident power in the Indo-Pacific through choices, right? Geographically, the United States is in North America with only small territories like Guam firmly in the Indo-Pacific. U.S. power projection in the region is a choice. And if the country decides to choose differently and retrench from the Indo-Pacific, that's possible. I think Americans themselves need to know exactly why its military is based in Asia in the tens of thousands and what those forces might be used for in the future, what risks might be attached to the forward deployment of those forces. And the rest of the world, people in Europe and elsewhere, they also should be prepared for what an era of US engagement in the Indo-Pacific might look like, or an era of US inaction, indecision, or what I think is perhaps more likely strategic confusion and inconsistency. So that's why we should care about this topic of the depth of US interests in the Indo-Pacific. But what is my more precise argument? So I start from the observation that foreign policy and defense policies, they come with price tags attached to them. They cost money and they can cost lives. There are very high risks sometimes involved. And this is certainly true of US foreign and defense policy in the Indo-Pacific. Around 50,000 or so US troops in Japan, over 20,000 in South Korea, smaller garrisons of hundreds or sometimes in the thousands spread across Australia, the Philippines, Guam, of course, US territory. New partnerships being built in places like Papua New Guinea, long-standing alliance commitments to Australia, New Zealand, Thailand, South Korea, Japan, the Philippines, and so forth, and kind of difficult to categorize security relationships, obviously with Taiwan, which I'm sure we'll talk about today, Vietnam and others. These forces and these alliances and these strategic partnerships, they exist primarily to deter a war in East Asia, deter war with China, but also fight and win a war should it be necessary. In that sense, deterrence is sort of a paradox. You have to be willing to fight, incredibly willing to fight and win a war in order that you don't have to fight the war because your adversary will be deterred from starting one. But it's a wager, right? A risk. And the US engagement in the Indo-Pacific, centered around the deterrence of China, saddles the United States with a very heavy burden of one day having to follow through on those implicit threats to fight the United States. A second assumption beyond the fact that it has risks involved is that these costs get pointed out domestically. Now, we all know that the voting public doesn't always pay too much attention to foreign policy, but the voting public is not stupid. And political entrepreneurs in a democracy like the United States have got an interest in selectively educating the public on foreign policy issues in order to get votes. In this way, foreign policy can be put under scrutiny and can be challenged. Leaders can't do whatever they please. They must sell foreign policies in a way that enjoy domestic buy-in and are insulated against domestic attack. The third and final part of my argument is that because leaders know they must justify costly and very risky foreign policies domestically, they tell stories that are compelling. Sometimes these stories and these narratives about national purpose and foreign policy can take on a life of their own, and they can animate foreign policy decisions in very significant ways. Ideas and interests have got ideas and identities, have got a very critical role to play in the shaping of foreign policy. But ultimately, stories and narratives about national purpose and foreign policy, they can be challenged. They can be challenged domestically. And what really matters when push comes to shove is the material skin in the game that a nation state like the United States has in a particular region. So in that sense, kind of grandiose, compelling arguments about why the United States is engaged in the Indo-Pacific are useful and necessary, but they can never, or they should never, kind of outstrip or oversell the extent of U.S. interests that are at play. To do that would be a mistake and to invite disaster. So how do we apply this to the Indo-Pacific? My argument is that the United States has saddled itself with enormous costs and it's assumed enormous risk in the Indo-Pacific. And there's a very high risk of at least not a trivial risk of war in the region, especially over Taiwan. If there were a war over Taiwan or in the South China Sea or on the Korean Peninsula, U.S. troops could be involved in that conflict, and that's a very, very serious thing for the United States and the voting public to recognize. If there were a war over Taiwan, many analysts think China wouldn't wait to find out if the U.S. would intercede on Taiwan's behalf. It would assume the engagement of the U.S. forces and strike preemptively to keep them out of the conflict. We don't know that for sure, but there's certainly a risk that could happen. Now, huge deployments, massive public spending necessary to bankroll those deployments, as I've said, are supposed to deter conflict. China has been described by the Department of Defense as a pacing challenge for the United States. And that means if you taken literally, it means the United States will maintain a level of spending necessary to deter China into the future. As China rises, we'll match that public spending. But it's a precarious piece, right? To base peace on deterrence is a precarious piece, and China gets a say in that. If China was to invade Taiwan or to initiate a conflict in the South China Sea or elsewhere, the United States would have a conflict on its hands. This level of risk in the United States, I think, cannot be tolerated indefinitely. The stakes are just not high enough for the United States. As I've said, for China, as a resident power in the Indo-Pacific, the stakes are high, right? Existential. For the United States, I don't think that's the case. Beijing is not Moscow during the Cold War. China is not the Soviet Union. It's not a systemic ideological challenger to the United States. It's not trying to overturn world order, although it is trying to refashion it. It's not trying to overturn it outright. The bottom line is that I think these competing hegemonies in the Indo-Pacific, it's not an existential struggle for the United States. Domestic forces in the United States are eager to participate in the competition with China, but it's disparate, it's sporadic, and it's incoherent and unstrategic. So things like the banning of TikTok or the banning of Chinese citizens from purchasing property in Florida, they get votes, they get attention, they get political support in the United States, but that's very disconnected from what's taking place in the Indo-Pacific. It's not a strategic kind of move that the Biden administration controls. It's something they've lost control of. I suspect in time, the top-level political leaders in the United States will come to realize that the financial costs and the military risks of an enduring Cold War with China are probably too high for the country to bear without some kind of thaw or the dialing down of tensions and some sort of accommodation. And the reason I think that is I think some people domestically, they will point it out. Right? They will point out that saddling the country with the risk of World War III is not worth it. In the same way it was worth it during the Cold War, I think Americans will decide it's not worth it today. And there are signs of this in both political parties, in the Republican Party and the Democratic Party as well. Small factions, to be sure, but factions who warn against the risk of war, the risk of nuclear war, the risk of an unending, uncontrollable conflict with China. There's a lot of frustration in the United States that allies won't share the burden of containing China. There are big concerns over the state of the public finances and whether we can wage 2 consecutive Cold Wars with Russia, or hot wars with Russia and China. Can the United States bear that burden into the future? People are not sure. And there's a lot of resentment about America's world role that was laid bare during the Trump administration. I don't think that America's top-level leaders today have got the big ideas necessary to sell primacy in Asia to the American public indefinitely. I don't think they've got the big ideas to sell a Cold War with China indefinitely. China bashing, as I've said, it is popular in some parts of the United States. Some parts of the electorate do respond for that, but it's very ugly, right? It can be a very ugly thing. And I think there are limits to how far a purely negative set of stories about China and Beijing can kind of really sustain a grand strategy. I think there are limits to that. As Lord Bruce said, trade levels between the United States and China are record highs, according to some measures. So this kind of complicates the narrative that China is an evil empire that must be defeated at all costs. If in fact, American consumers and firms are willing to do business with China at record levels, it just doesn't ring true. I think efforts to sell the competition with China as this existential, titanic struggle for the survival of democracy will probably fail simply because they're not credible. I don't think China does pose a threat to the survival of democracy worldwide. And people domestically, they will point that out, right? I think that will be pointed out and exposed. So America's interest is certainly to prevent a dominant power, a dominant hegemonic military power, from consolidating control over any region of the world, and especially East Asia. That's true. Then, if ever it became clear that Beijing was in fact intent on the conquest of the Western Pacific, sure, I think the United States political system and voting public and all the domestic stakeholders would rally around a grand strategy of defending that order and American preeminence. But we are very, very far from that today. And I don't think the evidence of Chinese expansionism is sufficient to spur a domestic level response that many people seem to believe we're witnessing. I don't think we are there quite yet. And I think the commitments that the United States has assumed could prove to be more brittle than we currently believe. So at the end of the day, I think there's probably a reckoning to be had about the U.S. presence in East Asia. When you really think about it, U.S. garrisons and deployments in the Western Pacific, the kind of beached garrisons, right? They were sent overseas in World War II and the Cold War for a particular reason, and that reason has gone away, right? But the garrisons have remained. A reckoning needs to be had about why they are there today, and I think once that reckoning is had, a lot of Americans may decide that they shouldn't be there, at least not for the purpose of fighting a war against China. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was absolutely fascinating. I picked up on 2 words you said there, if I could follow up there. You used the word strategic confusion. Right. In the US. There's also a similar in the European Union and in Britain. In fact, it's talked about a lot that we don't have a strategic policy to deal with the rise of China. Is China suffering from the same, or does that have no strategic confusion?
Well, I think China does suffer somewhat from the same. It's a little easier in an authoritarian system for the supreme leader Xi Jinping to impose his vision and his will upon the political system, but it's not a perfect system in that regard either. And I think there are competing factions in Beijing, and Xi has to pay attention to kind of this Chinese nationalist impulse that he cannot tame, right, himself. So I think there is some strategic confusion in Beijing, but it's less of a concern or less of a pronounced feature of the system than it is in the United States.
And it's easier for China then to create the narrative you were talking about what it's all about, whether it's ideology, whether it's trade, whether it's nationalism. They don't have so many challenges, do they?
They don't, and I think it's more obvious to leaders in Beijing what China's interests are, right? As the resident power in East Asia, there's less kind of to debate. Whereas sitting in Washington D.C. on the Atlantic coast to debate America's interests in the survival of Taiwan as a de facto kind of independent entity. Is less obvious what America's interest is in that, whereas sitting in Beijing is very clear.
Yeah, no, that's. Can I just put a question from Anand Tomar that you've touched on, but if you could expand slightly on it, Peter. To what extent are current tensions in the Indo-Pacific a battle between contrasting political and ideological systems?
So there's certainly a school of thought that it is absolutely a contest between domestic systems and, by extension, a vision of international order. I don't put myself in that camp. I think it's been shown in the past historically that the democracies and authoritarian regimes can kind of coexist and have kind of some kind of understanding between them, and I think that's possible. And the United States and China themselves have gone through phases in the past where the relationship was relatively constructive and stable and pursued for the mutual benefit of the domestic people. So I wouldn't overstate the importance of domestic systems, but I might actually be in a minority on that point. And there's certainly many people here in the United States who very much do view this as a struggle between democracy and authoritarianism.
And of course, in recent years, after here in Britain we had our golden era with China, suddenly almost overnight it became a Marxist-Leninist state, which put in that ideological thing center frame. Before I let you go, I just want to touch on a part of your expertise, which has got to do with this idea of rule of law. In that a few years back, Britain lost a case in international tribunals about its sovereignty claim in the Indian Ocean, which also includes the US strategic base of Diego Garcia. So a very fundamental key strategic element there. At around the same time, China lost its case in the Permanent Court of Arbitration about its South China Sea military bases. What is the difference between the way those two governments handled those international rulings?
So I think one difference is the United Kingdom has some kind of plausible deniability in the sense that the ICJ ruling was an advisory opinion. And although that's been cited in a binding decision by the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea between the Maldives and Mauritius, that wasn't binding on the UK. So the United States, the United Kingdom can kind of pretend we've never had a binding decision against us that we need to decolonize the Chagos Islands. But I would say, to the credit of London, the United Kingdom has entered into negotiations with Mauritius over the topic of handing over the Chagos Islands, including Diego Garcia, to Mauritius. So at least there is a political process in place that the UK seems to be responding to the fact that right now it's on the wrong side of international law. And it genuinely wants to be on the right side of international law. And it's a difficult process to get on the right side because there are national security implications, and the alliance with the United States is involved. But they're trying, and there's a political process, a dialogue with Mauritius to try and resolve that political dispute. You do not see that from Beijing. There's very little concern about being on the wrong side of international law. They think they can kind of weather that storm and do that.
They don't recognize, whereas Britain at least recognizes. And thank you for clarifying that, because it is coming up now, isn't it? And in the UN General Assembly particularly, it is discussed as the hypocrisy of the so-called rules-based order. Thank you for that. Our next speaker is Carisa Nietsche, an Associate Fellow from the Transatlantic Security Program at the Center for New American Security, all the way from Washington, D.C., that heart of the American empire. Her insight has frequently been shared in most mainstream media outlets. We're now privileged to hear them on the Democracy Forum. What opportunities are there within the transatlantic coordination to address the China challenge, and how relevant is this in the technology of these issues, because technology is at the forefront of much of what we speak about now? Carisa, Nietsche, enlighten us, please.
Excellent. Thank you so much for having me, Humphrey, and to the organizers as well. So as you alluded to, one of the main things that has been described as the United States' secret weapon in the US-China competition is our allies and partners, and especially those partners in Europe. So that's where I'll focus today, is really thinking through kind of how the US and Europe can cooperate together in order to address the China challenge. So I'll start by walking through the state of transatlantic cooperation to date, highlighting some areas where the transatlantic partners' views converge, and then importantly, areas where they diverge and where we must manage those differences. And then I'll offer three main recommendations of areas where the United States and Europe should cooperate. I'll zoom in a bit on the technology piece, as Humphrey alluded to, because I really think this is the epicenter of this competition between the United States and China. So there's been a slow shift in Europe over the past few years. We've seen the EU and China's comprehensive agreement on investment put in the freezer by the European Union when China sanctioned some European Union officials. We've seen an uptick in Europe calling out human rights abuses from China. And we've also seen a number of very affirmative, agendas that are really building out a defensive toolkit in Europe to push back on some of China's abuses in the region. That's included an anti-coercion instrument, a foreign subsidies regulation. So all of this is a reason to be optimistic, that the United States and Europe are converging around some of the same issues on China, and that our risk assessments and our perceptions are starting to converge. Another area is we've really seen the rise of this phrase de-risking. That's really the word du jour these days in US, EU, China talks. So this, is a phrase that started from European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen's speech in advance of her trip to Beijing. And then we saw this echoed in a speech by the United States' National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, at Brookings, talking about the future economic order. And then we've seen this phraseology also in the G7 statement that was released, reiterating the focus on de-risking, not decoupling. As ever, however, the devil is in the details. So while we are circling around this phrase de-risking, there is still some cause for concern that the United States and Europe are maybe not on the exact same page when it comes to the China challenge. So I'll highlight a couple of areas where we're really seeing daylight between the United States and Europe's perspectives. So Europe's China policy is driven by what they call the Holy Trinity approach, which is that China is at once a partner, a systemic rival, and an economic competitor. Now, if you look to the United States' national security strategy, you'll see very little mention of partnership with China. I think it's mentioned maybe once or twice in the context of climate change. You don't see it too much otherwise. So the United States is really defining this as a strategic competition. And there is wide bipartisan consensus in Washington. As mentioned previously, there are very minor factions. I would say a vocal minority who is maybe tapping the brakes on this and is a bit concerned about this bipartisan consensus in Washington surrounding the China challenge. So already this puts the US and the European Union a bit at odds, right? Europe is more comfortable with partnering with China in domains where the United States just isn't. And we see this in the recent G7 communique as well. If you consider the China section of the statement, it begins with, and I quote, "We stand prepared to build constructive and stable relations with China." This is not quite the tone that the United States typically sets. This is likely a tone set by France, by Germany. And we've seen that play out also in France and Germany's policies on China, where we see Germany willing to accept a lot more risk than the United States, as we've seen the potential approval of COSCO Shipping's stake in Hamburg port. So this has, been reflected in policies in France and Germany as well. I think a second main difference, besides this overarching feature of, are we partnering, are we competing, is this idea of, are we trying to stymie China's development, or are we just trying to protect transatlantic assets? And again, we can lean on the G7 statement a little bit here, where they talk about how policy approaches are not designed to harm China or seek China's economic progress and development. This, to me, reads as something that was probably negotiated and quite the compromise between the United States and Europe. We see a European approach that does not intend to stymie China's economic progress or development. On the other hand, if you look at the United States' policies on semiconductors in particular, there was a famous speech by National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan that noted that the policy before the October 7th export controls was to keep China 2 steps behind in development. Now, the goal is to keep China as far behind as possible. This, to me, sounds a lot like trying to stymie China's economic progress and development, which is certainly a goal that the United States and the European Union do not share. We've also seen, just earlier this morning, Prime Minister Rishi Sunak's comments that the United Kingdom will not use blanket protectionism to counter China, but rather a more targeted approach. I think that this is another area where the United States threatens to really drive a rift between US policy and that of our transatlantic allies and partners. We saw in those October 7th controls that the United States exerted a bit of muscle memory from the Trump administration. In trying to come to a deal with the Netherlands, reports indicated that the United States had threatened to potentially use the de minimis rule and to extraterritorially apply US controls on the Netherlands. This really strikes me as coercive diplomacy and something that in the United States' effort to prioritize China above all other challenges may threaten to drive a rift between our transatlantic partners. And I really do think that this example underscores that the US and Europe are not on the same page on this overarching question about what is this about? Is this about bolstering resiliency, or is this about stymieing China's development? I think that another indicator of this as well is National Security Advisor Sullivan's speech at Brookings that indicates that the United States' way of moving forward in this competition is through industrial policy. And this is something that, Prime Minister Sunak's comments certainly apply to, that the United States is engaging in a bit of protectionism in its fight against China. And I think that this is another area that there are knock-on effects for the transatlantic partnership. And it's clear that transatlantic partners are planning to approach this differently. On the French side, we do see comments from Macron, and we see him writing, in the Financial Times, that he does plan to adopt a very similar industrial policy to the United States. On the other hand, you saw Prime Minister Sunak's comments this morning that the UK will not use blanket protectionism. So this is an area where, while we're trying to say the same things, I'm not sure that we're quite on the same page. So where does that leave us in terms of opportunities to work together? I think there are 3 really promising areas. I think the first is really figuring out what we mean by de-risking. And I would argue that the very first step of de-risking is to look at critical and digital infrastructure. If we're looking at telecommunications networks, subsea cables, cloud computing, and then critical infrastructure like ports and energy grids, that's the place to start. I think that already that's pretty contentious. We don't see identical policies on both sides of the Atlantic when it comes to telecommunications networks and the idea of banning Huawei or de-risking from Huawei. We don't necessarily see the same thing on critical infrastructure like ports, as we saw from Germany's decision on Hamburg port. So I think let's start there. I think the next phase, the next step of that is on bolstering resiliency of supply chains. And I think starting with semiconductors is a good way to start, and then more contentiously moving on to green technology supply chains and inputs, where we've already seen a little bit of tension across the Atlantic with the United States' Inflation Reduction Act. So I think let's start with critical and digital infrastructure. That's absolutely the most pivotal. to protect ourselves and to bolster resiliency. The second area where I really think we need to do a better job of working together is on linking dialogues in Europe and in the Indo-Pacific. A great example of this is the semiconductor industry. That is a global supply chain. However, the United States is currently approaching that through a number of what we often term bespoke coalitions. So we have the Chip 4 alliance, that very nascent alliance has only met once between the United States, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. On the other hand, we have the Trade and Technology Council between the United States and the European Union that has a global supply chains group. Why are we not linking those two dialogues? This is a global supply chain that needs to be mapped out and then also addressed in a global way among democratic allies and partners. And then let's not forget, because this is a UK-based organization and conversation, what about the United Kingdom? Let's open up that Trade and Technology Council working group to allow the United Kingdom into that as well. I think this is a first step, is linking those dialogues, having all of the semiconductor producers around the table in the room to discuss this. And then I think the next frontier is, again, looking through the green tech supply chain, where we see that US imports of rare earth minerals from China are at 78% in 2019. That is a strategic dependency, and one that Beijing has already threatened to weaponize. So that, I think, is the next frontier. And then finally, something that Lord Bruce alluded to in his opening remarks is the role of the so-called global South in countries in the Middle East, Latin America, Africa, and Southeast Asia. I think the G7 was a great first step here, but let's not ignore these countries. You know, the Ukraine war has laid bare that the so-called global South and the West don't necessarily share perspectives on Russia policy or the war. Right now, I think a huge reason for that might be that the United States and Europe are taking a bit of a paternalistic tone in their engagement with these countries. So despite our differences on these big issues, I think the United States, Europe, United Kingdom needs to think about how to engage the global South as equal partners. At the end of the day, we need the critical minerals and rare earths from these countries. And I think that we have to engage them then as an equal partner and not risk, falling into past colonial traps. So these are the three areas I would offer of a path forward for the transatlantic partners. I think that it's absolutely pivotal that the United States does not sideline our allies in the competition. While I think our goals are correct, and I would argue that this is a competition between democracies and authoritarian regimes, I do bristle with our approach. I think we are risking sidelining our allies and partners. And again, this is the secret weapon for the United States. So let's think about how we can harness our alliances, our partnerships, and really work towards building a resilient, free, and open Indo-Pacific together. Thank you.
Carisa, Nietsche, thank you very much for that. Is there, I'm still, this idea of strategic confusion is still banging around in my head, and I think you've amplified it and corroborated it in that, are we confused in the West and democracies as to what critical infrastructure actually is? I mean, is it okay for, or we in Britain, I don't think have got the slightest idea of what China should or should not invest in? It's not, our 5G network, no now. Power stations, no, but it's in one already, so it's staying. I mean, has anybody got a list of what it should and should not be involved with?
So I think a great starting point is the United States recently released a Cybersecurity Act. So it's our long-term cybersecurity strategy and plan. In that strategy, we outlined what we dub as critical infrastructure. So I think that is a great starting point. It is a lot of the things that you just mentioned, and a good amount of that, because it has a cybersecurity lens, is focused in response to the Colonial Pipeline attack. So I think that list of critical infrastructure is maybe a great starting point. But I do think that this is an area where there is strategic confusion across the Atlantic on what is considered critical infrastructure, what is considered strategic. I mean, if you look at this idea, the United States would certainly not allow Costco Shipping to invest in any of its ports, but we're seeing that decision is acceptable in Germany. So, the foreign ministry and the chancellery finally did consider that critical infrastructure. I think that happened later on in the process, but yet still are willing to accept that risk and allow them into the network. So I think it's a two-part question. One is what is considered critical infrastructure. And then the second is is all critical infrastructure than an area where, no China. I would argue that the United States is probably on one end of the spectrum on that, as you can imagine. Like, all of that is probably not fair game. Whereas I think you see, a more moderated approach across the Atlantic.
And you were talking about the sort of divisions or different viewpoints between Europe and America, and to what extent is this differing from the lead up to, say, the Iraq War, when Donald Rumsfeld said, there's an old Europe and a new Europe, i.e. dismissing one and accepting the allies? Are we seeing similar divides, or is it now more sophisticated?
I think that, especially if you look to the European Union and then, add in the United Kingdom as well, you really do have 27, with UK, 28 different China policies across the alliance. And I think that this is one area where, there's always that age-old question, right? That when you call Europe, who do you call? And I think that in past administrations, there was a different approach. In the Obama administration, you definitely saw that Obama and Chancellor Merkel in Germany were kind of kindred spirits in a way. That's who Obama called when he called Europe. You're seeing now that the answer to that question is the European Union. You're seeing President Biden call the EU. And I think that approach is good. Yes, let's call the EU. However, it does risk something really important, and that's it leaves a lot of open room for maneuver on the table. I think we have, in the European Union, the Netherlands, the Czech Republic, Lithuania, all willing to take a harsher stance on China that's certainly more in line with the United States is. And I think by not working directly with those allies and partners and instead only appealing to the European Union level conversation, we're really missing out on some opportunities to work together in a meaningful way that pushes the envelope a little bit further than the European Union, where you do kind of wind up at the end of the day with a lowest common denominator approach. What Hungary will accept is very different, I think, than what France or Germany will accept, and it's different than the Czech Republic.
Yeah, so we're still in this confused environment. Amit Rana asks a question that I'll put to you. If the US is viewed by many Indo-Pacific countries as having greater military sway and China more economic sway, how might this play out in terms of choosing sides?
I think this is a really great question.
Isn't it? Yeah.
I would argue that the United States' approach has been kind of a full spectrum approach. I think that the United States is trying to increase its economic sway. I do think that some recent US policies might actually threaten to really cement Mr. Rana's really insightful ideas here. And that's that sometimes the United States' economic policies do drive us a bit further inward. And I think we're certainly seeing in Europe very visceral reactions to that with the Inflation Reduction Act. If we look to the Indo-Pacific, in Japan and South Korea, also reactions to that policy. So in terms of how the Indo-Pacific might go about choosing sides, then I think the US can't really shoot itself in the foot here. I think we have to be a little bit more careful in moderating some of these industrial policies to ensure that we aren't creating this kind of false choice, right, between China on the economic side and the United States on the military side. Because at the end of the day, in that region, both are very important. And I think it'll just depend on how the United States proceeds. And then finally, I would say this also depends on our development strategy as well. How are we operationalizing in the European Union, the global gateway, and among the G7, the partnership on global infrastructure and investment? How are we able to really work together with countries and partner with countries in the Indo-Pacific and in Southeast Asia on some of these projects so that it looks like there is an alternative to Chinese infrastructure and investment there?
Thank you so much for that. Stay with us. And we are now going to our third speaker, James Rogers, co-founder and director of research at the London-based Council on Geostrategy, whose mission statement is to promote a strong Britain, working closely with allies and partners, and to uphold an open international order. He is a familiar face on media outlets and argues that there may not even be competing hegemonies because China is not yet a superpower on the same level as the United States. That turns our whole debate on its head. So James Rogers, give us your view.
Thank you very much, Humphrey, and thank you to Lord Bruce and to the Democracy Forum for having me on. It's good to be with you. So yes, Humphrey, I'm very much going to question the assumptions that are forming part of this discussion, and I think also put forward by the two previous speakers. So are there actually competing hegemonies in the Indo-Pacific and beyond that, even in the wider world, insofar as over the last 20 or 30 years, Chinese power and interests have expanded beyond the Indo-Pacific to other regions, including South America and Africa, even along the Atlantic coasts of both of those continents, to say nothing of Europe and other areas even further beyond those. So what do we actually mean by a competing hegemony? Well, a hegemony is a political system with a quasi-imperial character defined by a degree of hierarchy with one dominant power, which to no small extent sets the rules and the agenda for everyone else. And there seems to be often in these kinds of political orders a high degree of dependence of smaller countries on the leading power. Now, in this context, I think it's fair to say that China has benefited dramatically and substantially from the hegemonic order that the United States and its allies, often free and open countries like the United Kingdom, Japan, Australia, and several others, have established since the end of the Cold War, or what we might call the First Cold War, with the Soviet Union. China's growth in power and wealth and productivity over this time, particularly since 1990, has been substantial, and we can see those that the expansion of this influence and this wealth in many of the key indicators that are put forward to represent it. So, for example, Chinese GDP has grown substantially, and it's only a few trillion less now than the United States. In 2023, according to the International Monetary Fund, China's GDP stood at $19.4 trillion in comparison to the US, which stood at $26.9 trillion. And this gap is projected to decline as time goes on, so that perhaps by the 2030s or into the 2030s, they may be standing at parity with one another. In addition, there have been a number of other indicators that we've heard put forward in the media. One of the most popular is that China's navy is now larger than that of the United States, the first time since the 1940s. And we've also seen other indicators. One is the Composite Index of National Capability. Already in 2007, it showed that China had exceeded the United States in power. And more recently still, we have the Lowy Institute in Australia, a think tank based there. It has an Asia Power Index, and it puts the United States with a degree of power at 80.7 and China at 72.5. So approximately 11 or 12% weaker than the United States. And we've been quite taken, I think, and the media has also been quite taken by this growth in Chinese power and wealth over recent years, and maybe we've even over-exaggerated the extent of the growth and also its potential impact, notwithstanding the fact that China really has emerged on the global scene, and particularly the scene in the Indo-Pacific over recent years. Moreover, I think it's fair to say that despite the fact that China is in no small part of a broader hegemonic system that has been shaped and put in place by a number of free and open countries, including the United States, it also has its own ambition, and those ambitions may not be to remain part of that political and economic global order through things such as the Belt and Road Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, the Global Development Initiative, and now the Global Civilization Initiative. It seems very much that China is seeking to shape the international order in accordance with its own interests, and particularly the interests of its government, the Chinese Communist Party. In addition, we have had lots of conversations, and they've been coming up in the previous two speakers' interventions, in the idea of de-risking or decoupling or diverging from the Chinese economy. And of course, that has become an increasingly important thing as Western countries or free and open countries have become more dependent on China for certain key commodities or strategic raw materials, such as critical minerals and rare earth metals, as well as certain manufactures which are becoming increasingly advanced. But it's also fair to say that China is itself decoupling or diverging from the dominant political and economic framework of the world through its strategy of dual circulation. So in some ways, China is already doing this itself. Western or free and open countries may also be doing this, but there is a degree of divergence already occurring, which to some extent we're still catching up with. So there is a risk that we will see increasing divergence in the years to come, and there is a risk that we will see two blocks emerging. In fact, I think that that's more or less inevitable. However, I think the extent to which we've seen or witnessed or represented the growth of Chinese power in recent years has been, as I said earlier, to no small extent over-exaggerated. And that's because we focused on gross metrics or gross indicators of power rather than net indicators of power. And this is an idea that's been brought to the fore recently by an academic at Tufts University called Michael Beckley. And in an article in 2018 in the journal International Security, he identified that actually these measures of power which have been used up until now, particularly GDP, but also the composite index of national capability, that these are not necessarily very useful indicators, because if we look at past periods of competition between two major powers, they've often not reflected the reality, and let alone the reality of who eventually prevailed. And that's because they measure gross power as opposed to net power. Now, remember, for example, that most GDP that a country produces is immediately reconsumed for sustenance of the population through the development of internal infrastructure. And there's often not that much left over for that government or the government of that country to engage in what you might call power politics, even less so to build hegemonic orders. And really, it's only the most efficient countries that also have enormous mass behind them that are able to mobilize these gross resources and use them effectively. So what Michael Beckley, this academic, says, drawing off another academic called Paul Barock, who was a Swiss demographer, he argues that the most effective way to measure the power of nations is by creating two proxies. One, of course, remains GDP. That stands for the gross resources available to each country, but you then have to multiply the GDP by that country's or those countries' GDP per capita, with GDP per capita standing as a rough proxy for the technological sophistication of that country, its stability, and its ability to use resources or to process them efficiently. And if you do those calculations for all of the major countries, particularly for the United States and China, things start to look rather different. So, for example, in 2000, if the US held 100% of power relative to China, China stood at 0.31. In 2010, again, if the US stands at 100, China stands at 3.71, or holds 3.71% of the US's overall power. And in 2020, it stands, or China stands, at 11.87. So roughly, it's 90% weaker than the United States if we think of it in terms of net power. So despite all of the things that we've spoken about during this discussion, China's overall power, net power, sorry, is significantly weaker. And that gives the US enormous sustained leverage. And this does not include, of course, all of the US's allies and partners that seek to uphold this sort of free and open international order. Beyond that, beyond the net power available to the United States relative to China, you also have to think of it in a kind of historical setting, particularly in terms of what the US has built up over recent decades, particularly since the end of the Cold War or even before that. The US has an enormous network of military bases which stretch across the Pacific Ocean from the continental US through Pearl Harbor in Hawaii and Apra Harbor on Guam, to a number of different military facilities, very large ones in Japan, South Korea, and in Diego Garcia. These allow the US to project its power across an enormous ocean into the Indo-Pacific region to support its allies and partners and to maintain a degree of status quo. In other words, the hegemonic order that exists in the region. And beyond that, although the Chinese Navy has now exceeds the US in terms of the number of warships available, the US's warships remain by far more technologically advanced and significantly larger. In fact, if you look at the gross tonnage of the US Navy in comparison to the People's Liberation Army Navy, that's to say the Chinese Navy, the US has around 7 million tons of tonnage available, whereas China only has 2.8 million tons. And those are spread out through very many smaller ships, many of which are less advanced. And beyond that, the US also has the ability to project that force around the world using its carrier strike groups, of which it has 11, whereas China is only just getting into the carrier game. And beyond that, then there's a whole array of US nuclear submarines, again, an area where China is largely considered to be rather deficient. And if you look beyond these indicators of the here and now, the situation doesn't look particularly much better for China. So, for example, if you look at the long-term indicators, it's not clear that China will ever overtake the US in terms of net power, particularly because the Chinese population is aging, and it's aging rather rapidly. So it is thought by China's National Bureau of Statistics that China's population apexed in 2021, that's 2 years ago, at 1.4, just over 1.4 billion people. But last year it declined by 800,000 people. And by 2050, China's National Bureau of Statistics thinks that the Chinese population will fall to under 600 million. Now, if you compare this to the United States, the situation is very, very different. So the United States Census Bureau predicts that China's population will continue to grow for the remainder of the 21st century. And whereas there were 323 million Americans in 2016, there could be well over 400 million by the middle of the century. So this suggests that the United States has a much stabler population structure. It's continuing to grow, in relation to China, where we will see significant aging and even a significant declining of the population. This is not the kind of power base from which a country can construct an alternative hegemonic order. However, this doesn't necessarily mean that China will not be a significant challenge to the United States, to say nothing of countries in the Indo-Pacific that are also rather worried about China's rise. And here we can think of countries such as Japan, the Philippines, Vietnam, Australia, and even India. Now, if I draw your attention back to the idea of net as opposed to gross power, if we apply the same system, that's to say GDP multiplied by GDP per capita to the Soviet Union in 1980, it only held 9.2% of the United States' net power. In that context, it was still a significant challenge to the United States, and the United States considered it to be the major foe of its global interests. And it was seen that way also by many European countries, including Britain, of course, as well as France and West Germany. So even though the strategic situation will continue to favor the United States, and even though there are serious long-term impediments to China's emergence as a fully fledged superpower, it's quite likely that we will continue to see a very volatile and deteriorating situation, or even worsening situation, in the Indo-Pacific as something akin to a Cold War, small c, small w, begins to settle in. What's more, I think that this new Cold War, or second Cold War, if you will, and it is going to be a Cold War because it will be waged under nuclear conditions which prevent the United States and China from thinking of coming to blows in the way that, say, Britain and Germany did in the past, or Britain and France did in the past, because of the risk of mutually assured destruction. This will encourage a very long, drawn-out, protracted form of confrontation. We've already accepted this in our strategic reviews, whether the United States or Australia or the United Kingdom. We've called it terms such as grey zone competition, or grey zone conflict, systemic competition, and so on and so forth. But the idea is essentially that there will be a long, drawn-out competition. The only thing is, I think that this will be significantly more dangerous than the previous Cold War. Firstly, because the Chinese are increasingly aware that they lack time, and there are long-term impediments to their rise and emergence as a significant superpower at on the same level of the United States. Secondly, they are significantly hemmed in by the US and by a number of allies and partners of the US throughout the Indo-Pacific region, and increasingly also by India, which is worried of China's long-term interests and agenda. In addition to this, I think there's also a problem in terms of generational issues, and that's to say that the generations within countries such as the current generation in the United States, in Australia, and in some European countries is not aware, to the extent that it was in the past, particularly in the aftermath of the Second World War, of the risks involved in case of a failure to deter this kind of systemic competition from becoming increasingly hot, or from the risk of miscalculation. And then finally, I think some of the local powers in the Indo-Pacific are not particularly keen on the creation of a broader or deeper alliance infrastructure, particularly countries in Southeast Asia that seem to be quite keen on hedging, if you will, between the rise of China and the established political and economic system led by the United States. So for those reasons, this, I think, will be a significantly more volatile Cold War, if you will, or period of strategic competition than the previous one in the aftermath of the Second World War. And it also then puts a greater onus on us, not only in the United Kingdom, but also other allies and partners of the US, including the US itself, to think carefully about how to deter miscalculations on the part of the People's Republic of China and the Chinese Communist Party, but also on ensuring that we de-risk and also diverge insofar as China is also diverging from us in terms of our economic well-being, and in a small extent also to reassert a degree of sovereignty over economic dimensions as well as those that are political. If we can do that, I think we can navigate many of the risks that are before us. And in that context, we can continue to live in a relatively peaceful 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you, James Rogers, very much for that counterintuitive, I don't know what to call it really, but we are confused as to what China actually is. And the level of the rhetoric, the public rhetoric that goes around about threats, hypersonic missiles, invasions of Taiwan, and all that sort of thing seems to have been, correct me if I'm wrong, blown out of water out of that new sort of picture that you painted for us.
Well, I think there are those risks. Those are real risks, and they do exist. As I said, it's a very volatile situation because it's one that we've not been used to handling. A number of allies and partners in the region, such as South Korea, Japan, the United States, some of the countries of Southeast Asia, are having to adapt to the emergence of China. China's military buildup has been substantial over the last 10 to 15 years. Only a few weeks ago, the British Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly, explained that over the last 4.5 years, the Chinese have added to their naval fleet a navy the size of the Royal Navy's entire surface fleet. This is really a substantial naval buildup, and there are elements of Chinese land grabs and artificial island building in the South China Sea, which would suggest that China has, let's say, expansionist tendencies that will upset countries in the region, completing claims on sovereignty. We've also seen the same sort of thing occurring in along the border of China and countries in the Himalayas. So there is a real risk there, but we should not become so fearful of China and its rise that we become almost ourselves defeatist or fatalist, in the sense that there's nothing we can do. There are plenty of things that we can do to stabilize the situation, to support allies and partners. And
stabilize as opposed to win it. Can I give you a question from David Davis that goes into the theme of what you've told us? As Indo-Pacific nations with trusted links to Washington and or Beijing gain greater influence in how they participate in global affairs, will there even be a hegemon in the future?
Yes, there will be. The United States. The
United States
will remain the dominant power well into the 21st century and even into the 22nd. There is no country that mixes the different levers of power, the sheer mass, the power that can be generated from the North American continent, still protected on both flanks by two giant oceans, the Atlantic and the Pacific. The outreach that the United States has into Europe and into Asia through its military reach, the relatively healthy population structure of the United States, the technological dominance of the United States, and the general, notwithstanding all the recent things we've seen in terms of the US political system, the relative stability of the US political order. All of these things stand to ensure that the US has a great degree of net power over any significant rival. So everyone should understand that.
And of course, we have to remember that the network of allies and alliances that China doesn't have. So we're not talking about two counterpart hegemons in this case, are we? We're talking about one hegemon and something else, which Jason Kelly, our final speaker, will illuminate us. Stay with us, James. Is senior lecturer at International Relations at Cardiff University, a historian of modern China, served as an American diplomat in the US Embassy in Beijing, and taught at the famous US Naval War College on Rhode Island. And one of its mission statements from the founder, Stephen Luce, is that there is one way and one way only that war can be averted, and that way is to be fully prepared for it. Jason Kelly will lay out for us the challenges that arise when we think about US-China relations in the Indo-Pacific solely or even largely through this lens of hegemonic competition. Jason Kelly, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much, Humphrey, for the introduction, and thanks to you and to Lord Bruce and the Democracy Forum for hosting me here, hosting all of us here today. It's a real treat to be here for the conversation. I actually would like to pick up, I think my comments pick up a little bit on some of the things that James was saying at the end there, in particular this idea of the perils of fixating on fear. And specifically, I want to talk about the concerns or the challenges that I think arise when we think about US-China relations in the Indo-Pacific, but also more broadly speaking globally, mostly or even exclusively sometimes through this lens of hegemonic competition. So in other words, I want to talk about the concerns that arise, the effects of the conversation about hegemony on actual events and policies in the Indo-Pacific and more broadly. And I should say too at the outset, just that these are concerns that I've been thinking about for quite a while now. So I've been studying China and living in East Asia off and on for almost 2 decades now. And one of the most gratifying things I've seen over the past 20 years is that there's so much more attention paid to not just China, but the region in general. And that's been a steady increase since I first started paying attention to China. So that's very gratifying and a very positive trend for a bunch of reasons, right? But it comes with a concern, right? And one of the concerns that I have is that as more and more conversations are being had and more voices are participating in the conversation about US-China relations in the Indo-Pacific, I think there's a chance, and this happens not infrequently, that we lose some of the nuance that is really essential for understanding events in the region. And one of my biggest concerns as more and more conversations are unfolding is that the debate about US-China hegemonic competition begins to obscure more than it illuminates. And so with that concern in mind, what I'll do today is talk about just a few of the pitfalls that I've put together, I think, that come with a very narrow or tight focus on this idea of hegemonic competition, again, not just in the Indo-Pacific region, but also more broadly. One thing I should say at the outset, though, is a bit of a caveat. I'm not saying that we shouldn't be discussing the issue of competing hegemonies in the Indo-Pacific. I think it's a very important topic. I wouldn't be here otherwise. So this is an essential part of the conversation. My point just is that we need to be aware of the pitfalls that can come with this particular framing, especially if we lean too heavily on this idea of hegemonic competition. So that in mind, I'll start with one of the biggest concerns that I have, which is that just by virtue of framing international politics and US-China relations as hegemonic competition, I think it has a very subtle tendency to increase fear, potentially increase tension, and increase the sense of competition. And one of the reasons for that is hegemony. We had a definition, James gave us a definition earlier of what hegemony is, and that's a very helpful definition. I think in many other contexts outside of an academic setting, particularly in Washington, also in Beijing, and elsewhere, that definition is perhaps not guiding much of the conversation. And what concerns me in particular is that hegemony, the way that it's often used, both in Beijing and in Washington, it's not a neutral term, right? It comes with a particular normative or value judgment behind it, right? So we know this because when you look at statements from the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, for example, you don't see Chinese MFA officials calling for China to achieve hegemony in the Indo-Pacific or in East Asia, right? That's a charge that's leveled against the United States and what Washington is trying to do. And on the other side of the coin, you have US officials calling for a free and open Indo-Pacific with its allies, right? It's not calling for hegemonic domination or hegemony for the United States and its allies, right? So both sides are using it as a pejorative term, and that value is always there, I think, in popular conversations about hegemony in ways that aren't necessarily explicit, and it can shade the way we have the conversations that we have, right? Interestingly enough, the United States and China both explicitly renounced hegemony in the Shanghai Communique, which is still a cornerstone document of US-China relations, when they signed it in 1972. Now, obviously, that was a very different time, and the shared agreement on not seeking hegemony had more to do with a shared perception of the Soviet threat in the region. But the point is, hegemony in the way that it's usually used in popular conversations is really, it's a name for a fear or a sense of threat, of losing something, right? Losing safety or independence or prestige or access to resources and opportunities, right? The problem when we don't make this value explicit, or we lose track of it in the conversation about hegemony, is that it can cloud otherwise clear thinking, right? There's already plenty of good reasons, and we've heard some of them this afternoon or this morning or this evening, wherever you are. We've heard good reasons why there's concern. There is concern, and there is fear, and there is competition, and there's certainly tension. There are absolutely concrete reasons for that. But I think rooting the conversation too much in this framework of hegemonic competition, if we do it uncritically, it can very subtly fuel the emotions over time that are fueling the conversation, that are shaping the debate, right? And so rather than see some of these very real tensions and disagreements for what they are, and rather than treat them in their own particular contexts with their own idiosyncrasies, it's easier to sort of combine them with this larger bid for hegemony, whether you're looking at these problems from Beijing or from Washington, and that can be dangerous, especially if we lose track of it, right? Another concern that I have about increasing frameworks that focus on competing hegemony, or the increased use of these frameworks, is that it can restrict debate and flexibility in policymaking circles, right? So US-China hegemonic competitions, this concept has obviously gained a lot of headway in not just Washington and in Beijing, but elsewhere. And as it does, politicians in many of these key places find it increasingly difficult to show flexibility or to pursue agendas or policy proposals, or even much more discrete actions that appear cooperative, because it can leave politicians vulnerable in the next election cycle, or their boss is vulnerable in the next election cycle as well, right? I suspect, but don't know, that the similar dynamic is working in Beijing as well, where there are, I would imagine, very few incentives for mid-level, lower-level diplomats from the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs to seek out opportunities to cooperate with the United States, because this hegemonic framework has crept into the thinking so much. It's undermined any incentives to seek cooperation, right? Another concern that's related, I think, on a deeper level, is that framing the bilateral relationship as a hegemonic competition can shape the way we perceive what the actual regional challenges are, our own perceptions of them, right? So by this, I mean, nobody really knows. I can't say nobody. I would imagine very few, if anybody, knows what the intentions of Xi Jinping and the senior Chinese Communist Party leaderships, what their intentions are in the near and medium term and long term in the Indo-Pacific, or more broadly. And I think there are a number of reasons for that. We can talk about that maybe in the questions and answers. But we don't know a lot. We don't know a lot about intentions, right? And the danger is that this notion of competing hegemonies, it's a very seductive way to fill in some of the blanks that we have, right? It can allow us to presume certain assumptions or ambitions or intentions that are connected to this narrative of bidding for hegemony. And this shortcut, I worry, can leave people less sensitive to evidence that points otherwise. So in other words, we're less well prepared and less able to keep an eye out for evidence in terms of behavior, decisions that are pushing against this idea of bidding for hegemony And so it's easy to discard that evidence and instead look for evidence that reinforces the theme or the framework that we've already adopted, right? Sometimes the framework can be right. Again, I'm not saying that it's not an important framework. I'm just saying that it comes with very significant costs, right? Another concern that I have that's related to this is that the framework itself can obscure nuance. And this is obviously related to the point that I just made, but China is a very big country. It has a very large population. There are lots of views in China. The Chinese Communist Party is a very big organization. There are lots of views probably within the Chinese Communist Party about all of these issues, both large and small. And the more entrenched the hegemonic competition narrative becomes, the harder it is to keep an eye out and an ear out, or at least maintain the possibility that there are different opinions within the party, within the country about hegemonic competition or what China is after or what China's broader ambitions are. We lose that nuance, in other words. Another concern that I have that builds on that is that very subtly, I think, when we start to think about the bilateral relationship in terms of hegemonic competition, we start looking toward the horizon. We start adopting longer range frameworks, understandably so, right? And this is a concern for me because historically, we've been really bad at that. And I don't mean we outside observers looking at Chinese domestic politics and foreign policy, but also people inside China, right? Most of the major shifts that have changed Chinese politics dramatically and that have then changed Chinese foreign relations dramatically. The kinds of issues that I teach here at Cardiff University in my China and the World module, most of those events were not anticipated by observers inside China or outside China. So big shifts like the Great Leap Forward in the 1950s, the Cultural Revolution in the 1960s, opening and reform under Deng Xiaoping in the late 1970s, the Tiananmen Square protests and the clampdown in 1989 in June, right? These major events were not on anybody's radar, at least those people who are looking, in particular, those people who are looking far down the road and trying to make long-term projections about where China's headed at that time, where the Soviet Union was headed and where the United States were headed. And so I worry that if we're too fixated on the framework, we unconsciously accept the validity of these underlying presumptions about long-term trends, and we lose track of the sight that they're built on sand and that they're meant to be helpful tools for clarifying, but they can be quite misleading if we expect them to actually predict outcomes, right? Last point that I'll touch on here actually builds on a couple of comments that we've heard today, and it gets at the idea that the hegemonic competition framework runs the risk of obscuring views, perspectives, and issues in the broader Indo-Pacific region, right? So this was something that came home to me resoundingly clearly last winter when I had the chance to travel with the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations to Southeast Asia. It's a winter trip to meet with officials in multiple countries to talk about U.S.-China relations as it's seen from the perspective in the region. And the big theme that came through this trip was, first of all, this is a rich, vibrant, diverse, complex region with all kinds of issues and concerns and ambitions that are critically important for understanding U.S. policy in the region if you want U.S. policy to be successful, right? The concern is that this broader narrative of bilateral U.S.-China competition, if not used carefully, can run roughshod over all of these nuances and differences and diverse opinions in the region, right? And that has real potential policy implications over time, right? United States policy during the Cold War, there were some significant examples of cases where multiple presidential administrations lost sight of local complexity and local diversity and what people wanted from within the region. And it had disastrous political consequences, right? So it's important to keep this, I think, in mind as we have a conversation about hegemonic competition. Again, I'll close just to reiterate the point that I do think it's important to have a conversation about competing hegemonies in the region, but we need to take it with a grain of salt. We need to be aware that there are limitations and pitfalls that come with that framing. I will stop there and turn it back over. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just to encapsulate what you said there, so that we're on the right track as we move to the Q&A and other elements here. The narrative that we're getting in our headlines here, that the voters are getting in Europe and in the UK and in America, is basically on hegemonic competition. It's on this rivalry between these two powers. And as James Rogers says, maybe China isn't what it is, but it's being built up to be that. If that narrative continues, as you said, people are being pushed into corners and things are going to get very dangerous. How do the politicians, because they're leading on this, change that narrative into something compelling that voters will understand, that is more accurate about what's actually going on?
Fantastic question. My response to that would be, I'm not sure that it's necessarily the politicians' responsibility to do that, or that they should be trusted to do that. They have their own particular concerns and considerations.
So who does it if it's not the politicians?
Scholars, scholars, journalists, specialists, diplomats, analysts, people who others, like I'd said at the outset, over the past 20 years, there's been this blossoming of public conversation about China. NGOs, think tanks, like some of the ones that are represented here. These are excellent platforms to help inject some additional nuance into these debates. I don't live in Washington, D.C. now, but I did in the past. And I know that there are opportunities to have conversations with politicians. So maybe they're not responsible for shaping the narrative, or can't be relied upon to shape the narrative in a more nuanced way. At least you can have conversations with some of these people behind closed doors to make sure that they understand that there is a difference between the narrative that appears on a public outlet or a TV show and what actually shapes decision-making behind the scenes.
I think you've hit the nail on the head about the narrative for a TV show. Our Foreign Secretary James Cleverly came out with a very good, in my view, a speech at Mansion House a couple of weeks back, where he did emphasize the nuances of China, and that it wasn't an Iraq or it wasn't a Libya, and that's the message he's trying to get through. Can I put to you you touched on it before, a question from Dr. KK Ubatai. What do the panel see as the main challenges to the US effectively coordinating with its allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific? This is listening to the locals in a way.
I think one of the largest challenges is, like you said, controlling the message. I think by design, it's supposed to be an open debate, and it shouldn't be everybody singing from the same sheet of music. And that means that there's a lot of distortion. There are a lot of discordant voices who are in the choir, which makes it a massive challenge to navigate. And also it's difficult to tailor messages to different audiences as well. So it's not an easy task. And this is one of the reasons why I think it's not the responsibility necessarily of policymakers alone to manage the message, because they're contending with different audiences and different objectives, which makes it quite difficult.
And one other one for a member of the audience with your Naval War College and former diplomat hat on. In the view of this is from Philip Bowman, in the view of the de-risking strategy arising from the G7 summit, how might this impact the US's commitment on the Indo-Pacific region? How would it impact that commitment?
It's a good question. I don't know that we'll have a significant impact on US commitment, because I do think the US commitment in certain respects is quite consistent. My sense is that there's a very real understanding that the United States needs to maintain a presence in the region, whether that's valid or not, or whether that's a proper perception. And Peter had some good comments earlier about this. But I think that my sense is that the consensus, at least in the United States, broadly speaking, is that commitment is quite solid, and I don't see anything really changing. I don't see de-risking necessarily changing at least the security component of that commitment to the region. Big question is the financial and economic commitment. That's a massive question mark, and that's a theme that came up again and again and again throughout Southeast Asia when I was traveling there. There's a very large disconnect between those two elements of the U.S. commitment in the region that is a problem.
That is fascinating. I've got a question from Ritu Madan that I want to pull out to the panel in a sort of round, beginning with Peter Harris at the end. It's about Taiwan, but it can bring in a lot of other things that come up. Is America's security commitment to Taiwan a double-edged sword? Too strong and it will embolden supporters of independence to cross the red line. Too weak and China will be encouraged to adopt a military solution to the Taiwan issue. Could you address that, Peter Harris, but also this too strong on too weak thing on both sides when we're talking about these regional hegemons that exist or don't exist?
It's a great question. So my response would be to caution against overemphasizing the role of the United States as compared to the Taiwanese themselves. I think people in Taiwan have got a very strong incentive to avoid crossing what's perceived to be a red line. Opinion polls in Taiwan show pretty clearly that voters for both major camps there prefer the status quo above anything else. A declaration of independence or something like that is just not something that most Taiwanese are eager for. Even if, the United States was to give some kind of ironclad strategic clarity, commitment to defend Taiwan in the event of war, I don't think Taiwanese would want to bring that on. So I don't think we should focus too much on the United States. But what I would say is it a double-edged sword? Yes. And more importantly, it's a sword, right? And to rely on the sword or hard power deterrence to ensure security across the Taiwan Strait is a mistake. I think the focus needs to be on diplomacy, on some kind of accommodation, some kind of political reassurance for Beijing and Taipei that the status quo is sustainable and that the United States wants the status quo to persist. I think a lot of people in Beijing don't believe that. Right? They think that the United States is chipping away at the political status quo.
Is it? It isn't. I mean, the one China policy, which this is sort of based on dating back to 1979, is quite clear. It's that China doesn't invade Taiwan. Taiwan is not recognized by the US or major powers. And with that system, the two could build up trade and make each other very wealthy and run the whole computers for the world, it seems. Is that what is being chipped away at, that sort of basic trust and understanding that lasted for so many years?
So underpinning that, though, in the United States, at least as China saw it, or wants to see it, is that the United States is content to acquiesce in peaceful unification. That if at some point in the future the two sides of the strait, and it looks very unlikely today, I know that, but at least theoretically, the United States would acquiesce in peaceful unification. But there's some voices in Washington today who describe Taiwan as this strategic bulwark, like its value to the United States is that it is independent from China. And when people in Beijing hear that, I think they react and say, well, hold on a minute, you're not content to acquiesce in peaceful unification. You're not just putting this off, you're ruling it out, right? And you're essentially bringing Taiwan on slowly under the US security umbrella, and what you want to do is forego unification ever. And that is not what we agreed to in the 70s.
Yeah, I think that. So when our former Prime Minister Liz Truss went to Taiwan, or Nancy Pelosi goes to Taiwan, is that a good or a bad idea?
I think it's a bad idea, and I think if you ask the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, he may agree with that. And Biden and the U.S. military were not best pleased with Pelosi's visit to Taiwan either. I don't think it helps. I think it's done for noble reasons, but I think long-term strategically, stability across the Taiwan Strait is best served by reassuring all sides that the status quo is sustainable and that no one is trying to overturn this political understanding that one day, if it was agreed to by both sides, a peaceful unification could take place. And some of these visits by Pelosi and Truss and others, they cut against that impression in Beijing. It was not helpful.
Of course, I think it was quite ironic that when Pelosi went and when President Chiang went to the US, there were massive Chinese exercises, and when Liz Truss went, there was just a weak comment complaining, and nothing happened. No covers were taken off guns and that sort of thing. Right. Carisa, Nietsche, on the Taiwan issue, that America's security commitment too strong, too weak. Give us your thoughts on that.
So I agree with Peter, and let's not overstate the role of the United States in this puzzle, but maybe for a slightly different reason. I don't want to draw necessarily a false equivalency between what we see in Russia and Ukraine happening today and what could happen in Taiwan. But I do think that conflict has really underscored that when there is a leader who wants to revise the international order to disrupt what the United States would consider the free and open Indo-Pacific, and in the case of Russia and Ukraine, the European security architecture, they will do that absent of what the United States is doing. I don't necessarily buy into the security dilemma or into this idea that the United States is going to fuel and prompt Beijing into invading Taiwan. I think they will do that regardless of US policy to an extent. I don't think that we should really put too much onto the US's ability to kind of create this escalation spiral in the region. I think US intelligence assessments have shown, that is partially the case, but also that, kind of we're looking at a 2027 time horizon. And I don't think that a lot of that has to do with the US kind of sticking it to China in a lot of these economic domains. So, again, would very much agree with Peter that let's not overemphasize the role of the United States, but let's also not underestimate the importance of Taiwan to Xi Jinping and China's ability to invade in service to their goals.
And of course, if the KMT, the opposition KMT, get in elections next year with a KMT president, things will cool down a bit, won't they?
Yeah, I think to a small extent, maybe. I think we'll have to see kind of how that plays out, but I do think that could play a major role in cooling things down. I also think, again, the United States is also hoping to cool things down. We're seeing really through a flurry of diplomatic activity in May, and that the United States is trying to move towards what President Biden has termed as a thaw between US-China relations. I'm not super hopeful that will ultimately lead to any kind of thaw, but I do think that that is mostly based on domestic political considerations in the United States. You've already seen Representative Mike Gallagher respond to this thaw comment by saying, oh, listen, I don't know if a thaw is in our interest here. So, I think that President Biden's hands are really tied in the United States on this, because there is particularly Republican hawks, China hawks in Congress, who are really going to try to hold the president to account and make sure that he's taking a harsh and tough line on China with no, hope of thaws in the future.
That's James Rogers. Your thoughts on Taiwan? Too strong, too weak? Should Liz Truss have gone there?
Well, I think, Humphrey, there's a fundamental issue here, and that is that the strategic situation in the region has changed, but it's not changed because of anything the United States has really done. As I said earlier, despite the fact that the US remains significantly stronger than China in terms of net power, China's capabilities have grown substantially over the last 5 or 10 years, particularly in the naval domain. We've also seen pretty aggressive posture, as you well know, in the South China Sea, with the building of these artificial islands and their militarization, as well as pretty aggressive maneuvers, Chinese naval and air maneuvers in the South China Sea in relation to smaller countries in the region, such as Vietnam and the Philippines. Even, US ships have been, in some cases, forced to divert because of Chinese maneuvers. And we've also seen an increasingly aggressive Chinese posture towards Taiwan, with the encirclement of the islands with various air patrols, naval patrols, the firing of missiles, fairly bellicose statements. And beyond that, there isn't a great deal that the US has done over the last few years that's any different from what it did in the past. And in that context, I think we need to be careful as to who we focus on here. I don't think this is got a great deal to do with the United States. This is to do with the People's Republic of China, the Chinese Communist Party, and Xi Jinping's approach. Whether or not political changes in Taiwan will change that, that's people have made various projections there, but we do know that an increasing number of people in Taiwan feel Taiwanese and feel that they have their own sense of national identity. And in that context, and insofar as that's also an increasing number of young people, it seems to me that there will come a time when Taiwan will feel the need not necessarily to declare independence, because in some ways it's already an independent country with control over its own internal affairs. But nonetheless, there could be a risk of escalation, and in that context, it then becomes a question of whether the United States and other allies and partners in the region are prepared to stand up for Taiwan and to secure its continued, to secure what is essentially still the status quo. And that's a completely open question. We simply don't know what would happen. But it probably does make sense going forward to indicate very clearly that in the event of a miscalculation or aggression on the PRC's part, there will be some kind of response, whether that's an economic response or a military response. That's a very important and open question. And it will not be only one answered by the United States. It will also be one answered by countries such as Japan, potentially also Australia, South Korea, and others, because that would potentially set in store a very dangerous escalatory logic, in the same way that we've seen in relation to, say, Russia's actions in Ukraine. It won't just be about the United States. It will also draw in a number of regional allies that feel that they are themselves going to be affected.
So just very briefly on Richard Marden's question, too strong or too weak, or have we got the balance right?
I would say up until relatively recently, the balance has been right. As I said, it is China that is fundamentally changing the strategic situation here, not the United States, not Taiwan. So we now need to start thinking about whether we've got the balance right going forward. And this balance will not just be about the United States. It will also draw in other regional actors that have an interest in this.
Thank you. Jason Kelly, can you just give us your thoughts on the Taiwan thing? But the thought, as James was talking there, is that we did nothing. When I say we, the US and the West did nothing when those South China Sea bases began to be built in 2012, around the same time that Vladimir Putin 2 years later went and took Crimea, and we did nothing. Have we got the balance right now on Taiwan, or should we change that balance?
That's the $1 million question. I think the balance up to now has been, the policy balance has been appropriate, I think, and whether it's a dual-edged sword, I think of it as more like dual deterrence, right? The US policy is to ensure that neither side of the strait unilaterally changes the status quo, right? So that's the policy foundation for the relationship now. And I think that's been the case for decades. I don't see a reason to change it. I think if it should change, there needs to be a very thorough and careful conversation about what the risks of changing it are, going back to the escalation dynamics that came up earlier, and the potential for conflict, and what the gains are, right? And that's, to my knowledge, from my perspective, it seems like the risks far outweigh the gains, at least in terms of changing the policy architecture. The second part of that, there's not just the policy architecture, but also the way that different governments apply pressure within that structure, right? So there's a very careful, calibrated process that diplomats and officials in Washington have to think about when they are watching developments in Taiwan, which is a vibrant democracy with a lot of different views, and then some of the language coming out of Beijing. And how is it that Washington can use this existing policy structure to ensure that there's sufficient pressure on both sides not to push for that unilateral change in the status quo?
Thank you very much for that. And now it is time, as we draw to the end of our Democracy Forum debate, fascinating as it's been, to bring in the wisdom of our chair, Barry Gardiner MP, a veteran of hegemonic competition, although it might not be that in the Indo-Pacific, deeply knowledgeable about that region, and his political party might imminently be in power in the United Kingdom. So Barry, what do you make of it all?
I think the word strategic confusion described my mental state very, very well, actually. Look, it has been a fascinating discussion, and I want to start off by paying tribute to Charles, because he always really focuses our minds at the beginning of these discussions. I want to go back to the title, though. What was the effect of the Pacific region, China and the US? I don't feel that the discussion has really focused on the effect of it. We've analyzed lots of things about it. Sometimes we said it doesn't exist. Sometimes we said there'll only be one hegemony, not two. But I'm not sure that we've really considered the effect of the competition for hegemonies. Charles rightly started us off with the post-G7, and I loved his quote from Kissinger about how there's a lack of any settled principle upon which to establish order. I thought that was a very interesting comment from one of the world's elder statespeople. And a challenge to free international order based on the rule of law. We didn't talk much about, and I'll come back to that later on, because we really did not talk much about the rule of law, UNCLOS, human rights, and he spoke about decoupling in the US from international trade. Now, I wanted to add a caution there, because he spoke about most favored nation trading status. Of course, most favored nation trading status sounds as if it's a wonderful thing. Actually, it's a lowest common denominator. It simply means that you can't treat anybody that you don't have a trade agreement with any better than you can treat anybody else, or any worse than you can treat anybody else. So it's not a great thing. But I thought it was absolutely on the money when he talked about the whole move to domestic security, security of food, security of energy, security of the internet, security of the military. And what does that lead you to when there is that move towards domestic security, these concerns about the security of our supply chains in all these different areas? It actually leads you to an introverted form of nationalism. He spoke about the AUKUS Pact, the denunciation in Australia by the Chinese ambassador, the strategic use of trade policy, and that leaders are trying to unpick decades of globalization. And that is a really tough thing to do, but it is what we're trying to do at the moment. In this country, we've had these big debates about energy security recently, but we've now begun to realize that it's not just about energy security. It's about the security in our food supply chains. It's about every aspect of our security. And actually, the conclusion that you come to at the end of these conversations about how to unpick that, how to make yourself more secure, is it really isn't possible. We live in a globally interconnected world. And one way or another, it always comes back to bite us. You cannot be an island unto yourself. You cannot be that self-sufficient nation in quite the way that some politicians would like us to be. Now, Peter, I thought was a very, very good presentation here. Started off talking about US power projection and the domestic basis of it. Why does it matter? The Indo-Pacific need to know if US involvement is there for the long term. They've got the plan. They live there. They live in that region. They're going to be there forever. And therefore, their politicians, their economies have to plan for the long term. And they need to know from the US, are you involved for the moment? Are you involved for the short term? Or long-term player in the region that we need to take account of. But it was fascinating the way he talked about the military and the 50,000 troops in South Korea, the 50,000 troops in Japan, and so on. But I thought it was really interesting the way in which he then played that back into domestic US politics and said, actually, the US public also need to understand what this is about. They need to have a narrative that explains why their country is spending money doing this. And he gave one narrative. He said, okay, they exist to deter, well, those troops exist to deter war by showing you are willing to fight, but also being able to fight if you actually need to. And those costs of engagement in the region, of the hegemony, such as it is, get traded in US politics by domestic politicians to either justify or to challenge, why are we not spending more in this area? Why are we spending it? So the narrative is developed around that. And it's a narrative about national purpose. I thought, Peter, I'd have liked you to have then gone on to talk about another aspect of that, and that is the way in which that military presence in the region does play into domestic politics, in the domestic jobs that it creates in the military and industrial complex within America. So those defense jobs and how important they are for the US economy, and how it's important to keep on projecting the need to have troops stationed around the world for those domestic reasons as well. He posed an interesting question. If there were a war over Taiwan, he said, China would assume US involvement and do a preemptive strike on US forces in the region. I thought that was an astonishing claim. Certainly it's one that Isoroku Yamamoto might not have agreed with in retrospect, in hindsight. He, of course, was the admiral who, on the 7th of December, 1941, after Pearl Harbor, said, I fear all we've done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve. If China has not learned that a preemptive strike on the US would be a cataclysmic thing to do, then that was I thought that was an astonishing claim that was made there. Whether correct or not, it has huge implications. And he also asked, can the US wage another Cold War? China bashing may be popular, but is it sustainable when US trade is so intimately linked with China, when so many companies in the US are actually owned by Chinese interests? I think that's a really good question. And of course, the other thing is, do people actually believe in the US that China is representing a threat to democracy on a worldwide scale? And if they don't believe that China represents a threat to democracy on a worldwide scale, are they actually concerned with what China may do in its own backyard? No discussion here about human rights abuses, about the Uyghur situation. How do we in the West respond to genocide? And that's why I go back to what Charles raised at the beginning about the rule of law. And if we're going to establish that sort of principle, the established order that Kissinger was referring to, and it's going to be based on the rule of law, we can't leave out those aspects of it. Now, Carisa Nietsche, sorry, American Nietsche, European Nietsche, forgive me, Carissa. US secret weapon in China relations is our partners in Europe. Technology as the epicenter of the conflict. The US and the EU converging around this de-risking agenda. And of course, she also referred to Jake Sullivan and his new economic order speech at Brookings. Concern that the US-EU is not altogether on the same page. Yeah, we see it as what she called the Holy Trinity, the partner, competitor, and systemic rival. The US not seeing it in the same way. They would drop the first element of the Holy Trinity. I'm not quite sure who that means, whether it's God the Father or God the, I suppose must be God the Father. There we are, said it. Don't force the EU to choose between the US and China. But that also goes, I think, for not forcing those powers in the region, those other countries in the region, to choose between the US and China. Is this about bolstering sufficiency or about stymieing China, she asked. And that's where we came to saying that there was strategic confusion in what the West is trying to do here. It's about critical infrastructure. Do we know what that is? Yes, it's ports, it's cloud computing, it's undersea cables, it's power generation. And she spoke about linking up all our ad hoc partnerships in order to present a united front on this, spoke about the view of the Ukraine war, and asked a very important question about why is it that the global South does not actually see the Ukraine war in the same way as the US and the UK and most of Western Europe do. And I think that is an important question. Why is there that variance? And of course, there are. I come later to the point where we're talking about Taiwan again, and the potential for China to invade Taiwan in the way that we often make this parallel between Russia and Ukraine and China and Taiwan. But if each nation is pursuing its narrative, it's presenting to its people its self-understanding of who it is, then there is a narrative that one can see, one can understand in both of those. Putin reaching back to the narrative of the Soviet Union, the Russian Empire, and wanting to reassemble the parts of the Russian Empire in the same way as there is the narrative in China about reassembling the parts of China. And therefore the question is, how much does that push beyond that? And therefore, how do we understand China's threat to the wider global democracy? How does the American public view that? James said there's only one hegemony, not two. China has benefited from the end of the Soviet Cold War. Pointed out that China's GDP was only just less than the US's. But I wondered here, a question I would put to James is, well, if China's power is over-exaggerated, and I confess I didn't quite understand what the point of talking about gross and net power was, but if China's power is over-exaggerated, then what follows from that? And leading us back to our question, our original question, what is the effect then in terms of the Indo-Pacific and practical politics going on there? He spoke about China is seeking to shape the global order in its own interests. Well, yes, most countries are. And if it's trying to seek to project its own interests in the region, does that not actually indicate that, yes, there are two hegemonies going on here? So I wasn't quite sure how those two parts of James's argument came together. And forgive me if I've misunderstood you, James, but I thought there was an internal tension there in your argument, arguing that actually there is no hegemony from the Chinese point of view. There's only one real power here, it's the US, and that's the end of the matter, and backing that up with the whole distinction between gross and net power. But then looking at what China is doing, I felt if I look across what China has been doing with Belt and Road, what it's been doing not only in the region through Pakistan and String of Pearls, but also in Africa, you know, it is seeking to project its power, and it's seeking to accumulate the resources of many other countries back into its own economy. And I thought there was an interesting question there. If the US holds military sway and China economic sway, which way will the Indo-Pacific jump? Which way will they go? Jason told us, well, look, hegemony is not a useful concept. Concerned that the debate obscures more than it illuminates. It comes with a particular set of value judgments. He pointed to the Shanghai Communique that actually had renounced hegemony, and says the US is not calling for hegemony, it's calling for free, open, resilient Indo-Pacific. Well, we go back to the same few words there that I can't remember whether it's Peter or that used that phrase earlier. I just wonder, is the use of the term free, open, resilient Indo-Pacific, is that not just another way of saying that we want it to be our values that are the dominant ones in the region? Is this not just perhaps another way of expressing that drive for hegemony, and trying to ensure that you do dominate in the way that you think is, you get you bring people's minds with them by using phrases like this. It's a persuasive, it's a political, it's a diplomatic way of engaging with people. And, you know, it's a way of achieving influence. China, you know, it is engaged in Arunachal Pradesh. You know, look at the disputes China is having with India over its own land base and the territorial disputes that China has with India, as well as with Taiwan. Jason talked about the framework obscuring the nuance. There are lots of views in the Chinese Communist Party. Yeah, Jason, I agree with you. I've no doubt. But only one is guaranteed to keep you out of prison. If we are to be fixated on the hegemony framework, he said we can lose sight of the long-term trends. I'd be very keen to find out from your trip to Southeast Asia, Jason, where you were talking to leaders and thought leaders in different countries, just what they thought about US and Chinese engagement in the region. Are they fed up with the US framing their own importance as being the guarantor of freedom and resilience and democracy in the region? What are their views of that economic sway, of that political and military sway that each of the countries had? What did people tell you about their fear? What did they tell you about their hopes and their own purposive political involvement? Because on the whole, small nations don't sit back and think, you know, well, we just have to go with whoever ends up being the boss in the region. They believe, and they have to believe, that they are in political control of their own destiny, and that they have a part to play in framing that future. And that's what I'd really like to know, what people were saying to you about that risk, about that fear. Yes, we need to de-risk any conflict between these two rival powers. Yes, we need to try and normalize relations, not maybe go back to the golden era that the UK boasted of in 2015, to be sensible, but to see that we can have a strategic partnership, that we can look on China as part of the Holy Trinity, as a partner as well as a competitor. And I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
Barry, thank you. Whilst you were talking, a question came in. So can I put it to you from Fun Shakya, said that as part of a bid to boost ties with the global south, Narendra Modi of India and Lula of Brazil were among the leaders at the G7 summit. How important is that? Where do you see that going in the future? A short, succinct answer would be great.
India and Brazil are huge economic powers that ultimately are going to be as important players as the G7. It's absolutely right that they should be being engaged now. They are going to be dominant players this century. And if they are the representative voice of the global south at the G7, that can only be a good thing, because otherwise it becomes a big boys club. And I think it's really vital that those voices are channeled through, and that we do get in the West or in the G7 a reality check about how other people see us. You know, this idea that US hegemony is going to go on and on and on, that Jason seemed to believe. Sorry, no, it wasn't Jason. It was James that said it. Well, all I can say is I remember Keats in the middle of the 19th century. Happy is England. I could be content to see no other verdure than its own. Well, they might say the same about the US at the moment, but ain't necessarily so.
Barry, thank you. Thank you for that. Read about all these issues in Asian Affairs, our sister magazine. This latest one is China and the West, Time for a More Nuanced Approach, which I think is a little bit about what we've been talking about here. Join us, please, for our next Democracy Forum debate, June the 19th, Repercussions of Pakistan's Descent into Chaos. We've all seen that in our newspapers and television screens lately. Thank you, Peter Harris, Carisa Nietsche, James Rogers, and Jason Kelly. Barry Gardiner for your insightful close, and Lord Charles Bruce for so skillfully outlining the backdrop. From me, Humphrey Hawksley, and the team at Asian Affairs and the Democracy Forum, thank you for being here, and until next month, goodbye.
Yeah.